Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 4. It's been going well, I think, so far, and I hope that it's been helpful for you so far, just in the format and the content, and I really hope that this has been something that's worth your time. So this week we're going to get into something a little more abstract than last week, and we're going to talk about telling stories, because that's been a theme that I've seen working really well through my life, personally and professionally. So what I mean by telling stories is presenting important ideas, important things in the context of a story, right? For example, like presenting your resume as a narrative flow. Like instead of saying, I did this and this and this and this, say, well, I started here and then I went here and then I went here and then also I went here, presenting it as a story, in my experience and what I've been taught, makes it way more effective. And as I kind of looked into this a little bit more, it really is true, and we have good reason to believe that that's something that's really worth doing. So for many reasons, framing ideas as stories makes them much more powerful, compelling, and motivating, both internally and externally. Like as a personal example, when I was interning in an office a while ago, my boss, whenever we would sit down and have a meeting about a project I was working on, he would say, okay, so tell me the story, right? And what he meant by that was, don't just tell me what you did, tell me where this started and, where it was when you got it and where it is now. And he wanted to know, basically the timeline, not just what did I do working on it, but what is the timeline? How does this all fit together and make sense? And so it's that kind of thinking of, thinking in stories that I really think is going to be helpful for all of us to implement personally and professionally. So that's what we're going to talk about this week. So a few years ago, Vanessa Boris wrote an article explaining what makes storytelling so effective in learning. This was in the Harvard Business Journal, so obviously a very high-level source. And she had 3 main points. The first one was that good stories build connection, familiarity, and trust, making it easier to convey complex concepts and carry multiple meanings. So, good story, just like a fantasy, book, movie kind of story, or even just like I said, like a narrative flow of your resume. Like any kind of presentation as a story builds connection, familiarity, and trust, and just does a lot more work. It got a lot more bang for your buck, if you will. Her second point is that stories can work for everyone. They involve visual, auditory, and kinesthetic elements that allow all people to learn, right? Because people learn different ways. Some people need to write stuff out, some people need to hear it, that kind of thing. But with a story, you can kind of work in all kinds of elements, right? For kind of a visual learner like me, you might want to kind of draw me a diagram in the air. So, so I went here and got promoted, but then I moved over here, and that's kind of way you could do it. Or of course, if you're primarily auditory, just by hearing it, you'll get it. But if you're kinesthetic, you're going to need a little more, I don't know, maybe you might have to draw it out or something like that. But it's more engaging than, hey, here's my resume, hire me. It's a lot more engaging and a lot more compelling when you present. I'm using a lot of resume examples, but even if you're trying to explain, like I said, a project you've been working on, it's a lot more engaging when you say, this is the timeline. Or you're looking at college or a job, and you say, hey, this is what the timeline would be if I did this. And you're trying to explain it to people, for example, it's a lot more compelling to use a story than many other things. And the crux of really what she wrote was that stories are easy to remember, and facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they are part of a story. And so all the more reason for professional reasons, or even in personal things, when you're trying to help someone understand where you're coming from, it's going to be a lot more effective if you use a story, right? Something I'm thinking of as an example personally is say you're having an argument or a debate with someone, and you say, I think that's just really wrong. They might just go, oh, and you have a big fight about it. But if you say, hey, here, let me tell you the story of why that bothers me. It's not just this thing, there's a reason behind that. Like, that's going to be a lot more convincing. That's going to level the playing field, and I think really de-escalate it and say, hey, here's a story. Like, this is something we can engage with. It's not just something you're trying to hit me with, but it's something that I can participate in and understand. And so that's really the crux of this, is that facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they're presented as a story. So when you're looking at communicating with people, trying to convey to them something that you know that you need them to know, think of it in a story. How can I tell this in a way that is compelling and that gives this person the opportunity to get involved? So one main application I wanted to talk about that I already got into some was that essentially when we're communicating with someone, we're teaching, right? Like I said, there's something in our head that we need the other person to get in their head. And that's teaching. When you're trying to basically transfer or like airdrop, if we want to be really savvy, airdrop your ideas to someone else's head. But the catch is that information needs to be copied correctly, right? This is like, public speaking 101, right? Is like, I have an idea, and when I say it to you, you might have my same idea, or you might have a different idea. It's like telephone, where you can say something in someone's ear, but they slightly mishear it and they pass on their kind of wrong message to the next person. It gets even worse, right? And so the big thing to be aware of when you're communicating and teaching really is to make sure that there are minimal opportunities for drops of the content of the story. And so that's what using engaging mediums like stories and narrative flows, that's what is going to help keep that information from being lost in translation, lost in the noise between you and me. When I tell it as a story, I think that's really important to remember. So when you're telling the story of your business, your career, your life even, frame it as a story, because that's way more compelling and engaging. And again, this is something I think is so interesting, is it gives an invitation for the person you're talking to kind of step into your story and become a part of whatever you're doing. And that's really compelling because we all want to join with people who are doing cool things. And something I thought was interesting is, I've heard a lot of pastors talk about this way, and theologians, that this is a lot of reason why Jesus taught in parables. Most people have probably heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's because it's very effective. We all remember that because it sticks in our heads so clearly. It's a story, right? And it's an effective story for many reasons. There's a lot to that story. It's not just some fictional thing. Like it describes some very real things about us and about God. But two of the really important things about it are, one, it illustrates the principle in a clear-cut manner. Jesus doesn't just say, hey, if someone different than you is struggling, help them, right? Because that's a lot of the principle is, the compassion element and the reaching out to the outsider. That's a lot of the importance of it. And he could have just said it, hey, this is what it is. But he told a story because it's more compelling. Is one reason. And then it also probes to see what we will do in response. This is something I had to Google what other people thought. And this is something that was a big sentiment, was that the parables probe to see what we'll do in response. And what role did we play, right? Were we the person who passed by and refused to help, or were we the Samaritan who stopped to help, right? And so that's like I was saying, it's a good part of why it's such an effective story, such an effective parable, such an effective teaching method, is because it gives an invitation for the listener to participate. And that's so much of the power of storytelling in our lives. Okay, then I have a second application to our lives that I thought was kind of interesting as I thought through it. Because that's what we just talked about was a very external perspective, right? Jobs and work and all this stuff. But what about internally? How can we personally use this concept? So I thought about that a little bit. And one thing that came to mind really clearly was the aspect of responsibility. That when we understand our lives are one long story, we can take responsibility for our actions, right? For example, why do X dumb thing when you know that you will 100% pay for it at another point in time? Like a lot of times we see on TV shows and in movies, this character does something stupid or tries to lie about something. Do they ever get away with it? Never. Because you will always get what you pay for, right? And I think that's a lot of, when we understand our lives are one long story, we know that you're never going to outrun those consequences because it's one big story. And so it gives us all the more incentive to take very seriously our decisions and how we act, because we know it's always going to catch up with us, right? Like the Bible says, your sin will find you out, and whoever digs a pit will fall into it. And so we always fall for the things we set up. So understanding that we have responsibility in the stories of our lives, and that we're always going to be accountable for kind of the plot points, if you will, that we put in. It also gives us perspective. When failure happens, remember that our lives existed before that failure, and they will continue to exist after, right? Because if all we think about is just this moment, and this moment is bad, then it's like, oh my gosh, like how do I move on? But when we understand that our lives are one big long story, then it makes it a lot easier to say, okay, this is just one moment in time, and we're going to get to a better moment eventually. And then the third thing is motivation. Because I've mentioned Becoming Something with JP, great podcast. Something that he says, the whole crux of his podcast is every moment now is preparing us for a future moment. And we know, like I said, that when we think about our lives in stories, that we will eventually receive the fruit of what we invest in today, whether good or bad. Like the example, kind of the visual there of a garden. Right? If you plant a seed for a tree, what are you going to get in however many years? A tree. If you plant a seed for, some vegetable, you're going to get that vegetable. You're not going to plant, you're not going to plant like seed for a carrot or something and get a potato. I know it's not exactly that, but you know what I'm saying? Like you're not gonna. What I'm trying to convey is that you're not going to make a bad decision that is a bad decision at the time, or an unwise decision that is going to give some positive return. And that's a complicated. It's a complicated discussion, I think. But the principle I'm saying, though, the thing I'm trying to convey, that I kind of got at earlier, was if you know that a bad decision, that you're looking at a decision saying, should I do this or should I not? And you know it's a bad decision, but you do it anyway, that is 100% going to catch up with you. Right? And it, you like what you see is what you get. Right? It's just, it's going to happen. So it's being wise in those decisions. Like, if this is a bad decision, I need to hop out of it right now, because I know for a fact that it's going to repay me bad down the road. That's what I'm trying to get at, is like understanding the consequences of your actions, whether good or bad, that they're going to follow you 100% guaranteed. And I think that this narrative fashion really helps us grapple with that. So then, the immediate takeaway is make good investments today. Right? Lay foundations and plant seeds today, good habits, good goals today that are going to pay off down the road, not that are going to set you back down the road. And just know that in the long story of your life, there are going to be a lot of narrative arcs and things that pop up at one point that were set in motion and back here. And I'm not talking about like law of attraction or any of that nonsense. I'm just talking about, if you make a decision, you're going to see the results of that decision at some point. And so make the best decisions you can, so that you can have the best outcomes later. It's just about being wise with the moment you have now and being a steward of that in the moment. So that's what I wanted to get at about kind of having the story perspective on your life. Okay, so then in summary, remember to tell your life, your mission, your goals in stories. Facts are 20 times more likely to be remembered if they're part of a story than if they're just thrown out there. So tell stories and offer people opportunities to engage and come into your story, because that's way more compelling. It's what we look for, what we crave is a good story. So remember to think of things in that perspective, and remember that the things you set in motion today, you'll see down the road, in terms of decisions we make, we're going to see the fruits of that. So be conscious of that and have that perspective. Life is a long story. It's not just this moment. It's not just what we had in the past. It's not just what's going to happen. It's one long story. So remember to think of it in that way, and keep that compelling and engaging mindset going forward. So thank you so much for watching or listening. I really appreciate the support so far, and I hope this is helpful. Shoot me any DM, email, whatever it is. If you have any questions, any ideas, I would love to hear it. But thanks for your support, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.